Crimean War, Part 4. The Fall of Sevastopol, 1855. The battlefield of Inkerman had fallen silent, but the war did not end. The Russian columns that had surged through the fog were broken and repelled, their dead scattered in heaps along the ridges. Yet Sevastopol still stood, defiant and unbroken. For the men of the Allied armies, British, French, Ottoman and Sardinian, the victory at Inkerman brought no rest. Instead, it bound them to the grinding misery of the siege. What followed was not a single battle, but a year-long crucible of mud, fire and suffering, the slow strangulation of a fortress that refused to die. The winter of 1854 to 1855 was merciless. The Allied armies were woefully unprepared. Supply lines were stretched thin across the Black Sea, their base at Balaclava a shambles of bottlenecked docks and rotting stores. Roads turned to rivers of mud, wagons mired axle-deep, horses collapsing in exhaustion. Food spoiled before it reached the camps. Boots fell apart. Tents leaked under the icy rain. Men went hungry. They shivered in rags, their greatcoats worn thin, their blankets sodden. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Cholera and typhus spread through the camps like wildfire, carried in tainted water and filth. By some estimates, more soldiers died in those months from cold and disease than from Russian guns. A British rifleman wrote bitterly, "The enemy kills us with bullets. Our own government kills us with neglect." Sevastopol too suffered, but differently. Within the fortress walls, Admiral Kornilov and later Admiral Nakhimov turned the city into a citadel of defiance. Entire neighbourhoods were torn down to build earthworks. Civilians laboured alongside soldiers, women carrying sandbags, children fetching powder. Artillery was mounted on rooftops, trenches dug across gardens, streets turned into barricades. Russian sailors, their ships scuttled in the harbour, now served as infantry, manning batteries and redoubts. Black Sea fleet guns had been dragged ashore, repurposed to thunder against Allied lines. The defenders were short of food, short of medicine, short of everything, but they were long on will. The siege of Sevastopol became not just a military campaign, but a test of endurance between two worlds, the industrial might of Western Europe and the sheer stubborn defiance of Russia. Through the winter storms came figures who would become legend. Florence Nightingale arrived in Scutari with her band of nurses, transforming the care of the sick and wounded. In Britain, her name became a beacon of compassion, the lady with the lamp, tending the broken in the wards when governments had failed them. In the camps, ordinary soldiers endured with gallows humour and doggedness. Letters home spoke of misery, of rats gnawing on the dead, of boots frozen solid, of comrades lost to fever. Yet they also spoke of comradeship, of men sharing their last biscuit, their last drop of rum, their last spark of warmth from a guttering fire. When spring came, it did not bring relief. It brought renewed war. The Allied armies, reinforced by fresh French divisions and a contingent from Sardinia, now outnumbered the defenders. Their siege lines crept closer, zigzag trenches advancing by feet, then yards under constant fire. Sappers dug by night, spades scraping, earth shifted silently into baskets, men sweating in the dark with bullets snapping overhead. Every day the fortress thundered. Russian guns poured shot and shell into the Allied works. Mortars lobbed explosive charges that shattered trench walls and buried men alive. Allied artillery answered with equal fury. The earth trembled, vineyards vanished, hillsides were pockmarked with craters. Sevastopol became a volcano, ceaseless in its eruption. On the Allied side, The French carried much of the weight. Their numbers grew to nearly 3 times those of the British, and their siege work spread like a tightening noose. They battered the southern defences of Sevastopol, hurling shot into the bastions of Malakhov and Redan, those towering earthworks that guarded the city's heart. The British focused on the right flank, their trenches clawing toward the great Redan and the quarries beyond. Progress was glacial, measured in yards of mud won at hideous cost. Soldiers grew accustomed to the whistle of shells, the crash of guns, the sudden cry as a comrade crumpled beside them. They learned to duck instinctively at the hiss of a round shot, to tell by sound whether a shell would burst close or drift farther away. They lived in earthworks, dugouts, and the narrow span of trench that meant life or death. One officer described the siege as a slow murder. There was no glory in it, no grand manoeuvre, no clash of cavalry or roll of drums, only mud, blood, and endless fire. Each day was the same: bombardment, digging, patrol, waiting. Each night brought the fear of sudden sorties, Russians bursting from the fortress to strike the trenches in savage, hand-to-hand fights. These night attacks were vicious: bayonets, knives, rifle butts in the dark, men choking one another in the mud, muskets fired so close the powder-scorched faces, torches lit brief hellish scenes before being snuffed out in the struggle. Then the survivors slunk back into the dark, leaving the ground strewn with corpses. The summer of 1855 brought escalation. The Allies massed their artillery, hauling heavy guns into new positions, building batteries by sheer human labour. French and British pieces fired in concert, thousands of rounds raining down on Sevastopol each day. Buildings crumbled, the harbour filled with wreckage. The bastions seemed to shudder under the weight of fire. But they did not fall. Inside the fortress, the Russians endured in silence. Admiral Nakhimov, beloved by his men, walked the parapets daily, encouraging soldiers with quiet words. In July, he was struck in the head by a sniper's bullet and died within hours. His death shook the garrison, but they fought on in his name. For the defenders there was no choice. Behind them lay only surrender, humiliation, and dishonour. As the siege tightened, soldiers on both sides began to sense the scale of what they were part of. This was no longer a simple war for honour or shrines. It was a contest between nations, between modernity and tradition, between the industrial engines of Western Europe and the agrarian weight of Russia. The world was watching. Dispatches carried by telegraph spread news within days, not weeks. For the first time, readers in London and Paris followed battles almost in real time. Public opinion swayed with every report. It was, in many ways, the first modern war, with modern weapons, modern logistics, modern journalism. And Sevastopol was its heart. By late summer, both sides knew the endgame was approaching. The French, under General Pelissier, prepared to storm the Malakhov, the key bastion of the southern line. The British readied their assault on the Great Redan. The Allied trenches were close enough now that soldiers could call out to the Russians across the parapets, sometimes trading insults, sometimes trading food. But beneath the surface, camaraderie lay the knowledge that one final storm of fire was coming. And when it came, it would decide the fate of Sevastopol. The morning of the 8th of September, 1855, broke with a heavy stillness. For weeks the Allied guns had pounded Sevastopol without pause, day and night, until the very earth seemed to shake with their fury. Now, as the grey dawn spread over the ridges, silence hung in the air. The silence of men waiting for orders that would send them into the teeth of death. In the trenches closest to the Russian lines, British and French soldiers crouched with bayonets fixed, rifles loaded, packs slung tight against their backs. The smell of powder clung to their uniforms. Their faces were blackened with soot, their hands blistered from weeks of labour with shovel and musket alike. Some muttered prayers. Others sat in silence, staring at the earthen walls before them. The bugles had not yet sounded, but everyone knew they soon would. The target was clear. The French would storm the Malakhov, the massive earthwork that anchored the Russian southern defences. If the Malakhov fell, Sevastopol would be split in two, its lifeline cut. The British would assault the great Redan, another formidable bastion, bristling with cannon and defended by thousands. Together these assaults would decide the fate of the fortress. The Malakhov was a monster. Its ramparts rose high, thick with packed earth, braced with timber, crowned with heavy guns. Ditches surrounded it, filled with sharpened stakes and chevaux de frise. Inside, Russian infantry and sailors waited grimly, muskets levelled, bayonets glinting in the dawn. The great Redan was no less forbidding, a triangular fortress of earth and timber, lined with artillery, its approaches swept by crossfire. The ground leading to it was open, exposed, a killing ground. British officers knew it. The men knew it. But still, they would go. At noon the silence broke. The Allied artillery opened in a final, earth-shaking barrage. Hundreds of guns thundered at once, shells shrieking overhead, round shots smashing into bastions, mortars lobbing fire into the heart of Sevastopol. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the roar of iron. Buildings crumbled, parapets exploded, earthworks shook apart. Behind the guns, the infantry prepared. Officers raised swords. Colours were unfurled. Bugles blared the signal. The French zouaves and line infantry surged from their trenches with a shout. Bayonets levelled, they stormed across the open ground towards the Malakhov, their red trousers flashing in the haze. Cannon fire tore gaps in their ranks, men crumpling in heaps, but still they pressed forward, scrambling into the ditch, climbing the ramparts. The assault on Sevastopol had begun. At the Malakhov the fight was savage. French soldiers clambered up ladders, hauling themselves onto the parapets under a storm of musket fire. Russians met them with bayonets and musket butts, stabbing, swinging, grappling in the smoke. Cannon belched grape at point-blank range, cutting men down in clusters. One French officer later wrote, "It was madness. We climbed as if into the mouth of hell, fire and steel on every side. Yet we climbed still. Zouaves planted their flags on the parapet, only to be shot down, the colours trampled, then raised again by another hand. Men fought in knots, stabbing, firing, swinging sabres, teeth bared in rage. The earthworks became a cauldron, boiling with screams and smoke. Slowly, with terrible losses, the French gained ground. They poured into the Malakhov, bayonet to bayonet with the Russians. The fight swirled through the bastion, men wrestling in trenches, bodies heaped in corners. Cannon turned against their former masters. By mid-afternoon, the Malakhov was in French hands. For the British at the Redan, the story was darker. Their assault began with courage no less fierce, but the ground was merciless. The men of the Light Division and Highlanders surged across open slopes, swept by Russian guns. Round shot and shell scythed through their ranks, whole files vanishing in bursts of flame and iron. Men dropped their ladders in death. Others stumbled and fell in the ditches before the fortress. Still they pressed on, clambering up the parapet, firing and stabbing at the defenders. Redcoats fought their way into the Redan, only to find themselves engulfed. Russian reserves poured in. counter-attacking with a fury that shocked even seasoned veterans. The fight devolved into a nightmare. Muskets fired at point-blank range, bayonets punched into throats, stones, logs, even cannonballs were hurled down from the parapets. A Coldstream guardsman recalled, "It was as though the earth itself spat fire upon us. We were drowned in smoke and steel. 3 times the British surged into the Redan. 3 times they were hurled back. The slaughter was appalling. Regiments went in at full strength and staggered back as fragments. Officers fell in heaps, colours riddled with shot, ladders broken, ditches filled with the dead. The ground before the Redan became a carpet of bodies, red and grey tangled together, the soil soaked black with blood." By evening, the British assaults had faltered. Exhausted, cut to pieces, they could not break the bastion. The order to withdraw was given, the survivors stumbling back to the trenches, dragging their wounded comrades with them. But though the Redan held, the Malakhov did not. The French, bloodied but unyielding, secured their prize. By late afternoon, they controlled the Malakhov, the Russians forced to abandon it after hours of savage fighting. From that moment, Sevastopol was doomed. The loss of the Malakhov split the defences in 2, severed communication, and rendered the city untenable. Admiral Gorchakov, commanding the Russian defence, saw the truth. At nightfall, he ordered the evacuation of the southern city. Ammunition stores were blown up, bridges destroyed, ships sunk in the harbour. Fires lit the sky as warehouses and magazines went up in flame. The thunder of explosions rolled across the bay. Through the darkness, Russian soldiers streamed across the floating bridge to the northern side of Sevastopol, abandoning the southern half to the Allies. As night fell on the 8th of September, Sevastopol burned. Flames licked the skyline, smoke billowed into the dark, and the thunder of exploding magazines shook the earth. Allied soldiers stood in their trenches, too weary even to cheer. The French held the Malakhov, the British held shattered fragments of trench before the Redan, and the Russians slipped away across the bay. The night sky above Sevastopol was ablaze. From the Allied trenches, soldiers watched as fires consumed the southern city. Warehouses went up in pillars of flame. Magazines erupted in thunderous explosions, throwing earth and timber high into the dark. The harbour glowed like a furnace, the scuttled hulks of the Russian fleet silhouetted against the inferno. All through the night, the earth shook. Each new detonation rolled across the bay like a drumbeat of collapse. To men who had suffered a year of mud and blood to reach this moment, it was surreal. They had stormed bastions, buried comrades, endured the ceaseless roar of guns, and now, at last, the enemy was leaving of his own accord, vanishing into the darkness across the floating bridge to the northern shore. At dawn, silence fell. The siege was over. The city was theirs. But the cost had been unbearable. When Allied patrols entered the city on the morning of the 9th of September, they stepped into a wasteland. The Malakhov was a charred ruin, its ramparts strewn with bodies, cannon burst apart, earthworks cratered. The Redan was choked with corpses, the ditches filled to the brim with the dead of both sides. Streets were blocked with rubble, houses collapsed into ash, churches pocked with shell holes. The air reeked of smoke, blood and rot. Dogs picked through the wreckage. Here and there the groans of the wounded still rose, men who had lain through the night in agony, too broken to crawl away. Surgeons moved among them, their boots slipping in blood, their faces grey with exhaustion. Sevastopol, once the proud jewel of the Black Sea, was now a city of ghosts. The great fortress had finally cracked. Yet victory did not feel triumphant. The French had lost nearly 7,000 men in the storming of the Malakhov. The British had lost more than 2,000 before the Redan. In the year-long siege, Tens of thousands had perished from battle, disease, cold and hunger. And for what? A ruined half-city, the enemy entrenched across the bay, the war still dragging on. One British officer wrote home, "We have seized only rubble. We hold a graveyard." The Russians, too, had paid dearly. Their casualties in the defence of Sevastopol were staggering. More than 100,000 dead or wounded over the course of the siege. The southern city was lost, but the northern forts remained in their hands, and the Tsar's armies still held much of Crimea. In military terms, the war was not yet finished. And yet, symbolically, Sevastopol's fall broke Russia's spirit. The fortress had been a matter of pride, of prestige, of honour. Its loss was felt across the empire as a national humiliation. Tsar Nicholas, who had dreamed of expanding Russian power through the Black Sea, was dead by the spring of 1855, his health broken by grief and strain. His son, Alexander II, inherited not victory, but a bleeding war. In Europe, the news reverberated instantly. Telegraph wires carried word of Sevastopol's fall across the continent within hours. In London, crowds gathered to cheer. Bells rang, newspapers printed extra editions. In Paris, the victory was celebrated as proof of French élan. The Malakhov hailed as a new Austerlitz. Sardinia, though small, claimed honour from its role in the alliance. But amid the jubilation, there was unease. The casualty lists were long. The photographs and engravings from Crimea showed not triumph but ruin, the battered faces of soldiers, the desolation of trenches. For the first time, the public was seeing war not as painted glory but as raw suffering. The Crimean War was becoming the first modern conflict to be truly witnessed by a mass audience. On the ground, the men of both sides absorbed the cost in silence. British soldiers tramped through the ruined streets, searching for shelter among the wreckage. French zouaves lounged on captured guns, their uniforms torn, their faces gaunt. Russian prisoners sat in huddled groups, eyes hollow, their uniforms ragged. The wounded filled every church and cellar, the moans unceasing, the air thick with the stench of chloroform and gangrene. In the harbour, the scuttled hulks of Russian warships jutted from the water like blackened ribs. Once proud frigates and line of battleships were now half-sunken wrecks, their timbers charred, their masts shattered. Sevastopol's fleet had died where it lay, sacrificed to deny its capture. The war had consumed everything, yet in the midst of ruin, new lessons were being written in blood. The siege had shown the world the devastating effect of modern artillery, of rifled muskets, of industrialized firepower. It had revealed the importance of supply, of logistics, of medical care. It had birthed reforms in nursing, in sanitation, in communication. It had given rise to war reporting and photography, shaping public opinion as never before. For Britain and France it was a test of alliance, one they had endured together in the trenches of Crimea. For Russia it was a shock that exposed the weakness of its outdated systems, its poor roads, its primitive industry. In time it would spur reforms under Alexander II, the emancipation of the serfs, the rebuilding of the army, the modernization of the state. The fall of Sevastopol was not just the end of a siege, it was the beginning of a new age of war and politics. By the spring of 1856, the war itself finally ended. The Treaty of Paris forced Russia to accept limits on its navy, to surrender claims over Ottoman territories, to recognize the neutrality of the Black Sea. The Western powers declared victory, though many wondered if the gain justified the dreadful cost. For the men who had fought in the mud and fire, treaties meant little. They carried home scars on their bodies, in their minds, in the memories of friends buried in distant soil. They remembered Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, Sevastopol. They remembered comrades who had stood and died beside them in the fog, in the valley, in the trenches. And they remembered the misery of a war that had begun with a quarrel over shrines and ended with half a city in ruins. The Crimean War faded in time, overshadowed by greater conflicts to come. Yet its echoes lingered. It was the first war where the public followed every turn by newspaper and telegraph. The first where photographs carried images of suffering home. It was the war that gave the world the thin red line, the valley of death, the soldier's battle, and the lady with the lamp. Above all, it was the war that showed Europe what modern conflict would look like. Industrial, relentless, merciless. And in the ruins of Sevastopol, amid the rubble and the ash, the world glimpsed the shape of wars yet to come. From the river of fire at Alma, to the valley of death at Balaclava, through the fog-shrouded chaos of Inkerman, and at last into the smoking ruins of Sevastopol. The Crimean War revealed both the courage and the terrible cost of modern conflict. It was a crucible that forged legends, shattered illusions, and reshaped Europe. And though the names of those fields may fade with time, the stories of the men and women who endured them still echo, reminding us that history is not lines in a book, but blood and bone, sacrifice and survival. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.